Schoolhouse program. This is a new series of programs that we're going to start having in the Willows. They have had them already over in the other building. So they're bringing the program to us, which I think is wonderful. Saves everybody a lot of walking. And I'd like to introduce Winnie Christensen, one of our residents. And actually her husband Chuck is the choir director. Okay, so the name might sound familiar. And Winnie has come to us today to do a presentation on her childhood life in China. I'm not going to go into too much of the details, so I'm going to leave that up to her, okay? So, take it away, Winnie. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, and good afternoon. And this is a brand new PA system, so if it's too loud, I'm sorry.
Sounds good.
Okay, it sounds all right. All right. Well, it's delightful to be with you this afternoon, and as Linda said, we're doing this called In-House Schoolhouse, and there are various stories that are being told in these sessions. And mine has to be the story of growing up in the country of China. And you may want to take a closer look afterwards. I'll be talking about the pictures that are in front of you, and you can take a closer look at the map, but you have to be able to read Chinese. Anybody here besides Vera who can read Chinese? But my husband has put the vital places that we'll be talking about on the map in English, so you get a general idea, but that is a map of China. And it happens to be that 81 years ago, on October 2nd, I was born in a town called Xi'an, Shenxi. And if you can see that far, it's now called Xi'an, Xi'an. But that is sort of in the middle, northwest of Shanghai, part of the country in the interior of China, and that is where my life journey began. My parents were missionaries. My father went out to China in 1903, and my mother went out there in 1921, and I'll get to that part of the story in a bit. But China is a country that goes back thousands of years. It's a very ancient country and has a long-standing ancient history, which is just fascinating. I have a granddaughter who is studying China right now, and she said she wants to know everything about it. Well, I don't go back that far, but I do go back a few years. And when my husband and I had the opportunity of visiting China in 1990, we went to Xi'an, which is a very historic city. We saw an archaeological dig that went back 6,000 years, and it's called Bampo Village. And so there are other archaeological places that are really fascinating there. Now, just for fun, have any of you gone to China as tourists? You've been to China. And, well, she was born in China, so of course, hello, you're my sister. And Vera, were you born there as well?
Hong Kong, yes.
In Hong Kong, okay. So one of the places that usually tourists go to in Xi'an is that of the terracotta warriors. This is an archaeological dig that they didn't discover till the 1970s. And it was actually created over 2,000 years ago. There was an emperor named Emperor Qin who came from the 200s BC was when he was emperor. And he got an idea one day that he wanted all his army buried alive with him when he died. And they were to protect him in the next life. Well, as you can imagine, The army wasn't terribly thrilled with this plan, but the prime minister came to him with an idea. He said, look, why don't you have terracotta figures made that are life-size and that will match the people in your army, and have that buried with you. So they began that project. Now I have with me just a tiny little figure, these terracotta figures that they built. There are 8,000 life-size figures in that archaeological dig, 550 horses. And the army was very happy with the prime minister that he came up with this idea, even though the figures weren't discovered until a long time, hundreds of years later. But Emperor Qin also unified the country of China, and it got its name as a country from him, as Emperor Qin. So the terracotta warriors were found when a farmer was digging in the 1970s in his farm, and his hoe went through deeper than he thought, and that's when they discovered there was this huge army of terracotta figures underneath. And you know, when you see them, and we saw them close up when we went there in 1990, every face is different. They matched the faces of the men in his army. So it was quite a feat that they did there. Also, the emperor built the Great Wall of China. So he was very much a part of the history, the ancient history of China. The Silk Road started in Xi'an. That's the origin of the Silk Road. And it went all the way to the Middle East. And I have, or we have, a painting that was done by a Chinese artist in Xi'an of 3 very regal figures riding on camels on the Silk Road. And it is thought that the 3 wise men went on the Silk Road from the east to Bethlehem, where they ended up in the Christmas story, which is very timely because we are celebrating the Christmas season right now. When, during the time that I lived in China was when Mao Zedong was building up his army, and he brought his soldiers to 150 miles north of Xi'an, and that's where he developed his power and the people who were following him. But one of the cultural characteristics of the time when I was born was that the Chinese people were binding the feet of little girls. Binding feet. And what they did was, after a little girl had learned to walk and could keep her balance and get around walking, they took that little girl and took her feet, broke the bones in her foot, curled them under as tight as they could, and as small as they could get the foot, the more valuable that girl was considered to be and more marriageable and would have a greater dowry. So it was considered a thing of beauty. Of course, these poor ladies stumbled around on these hobbled little feet. And you can see this up closer later on. This is the actual size of a woman in China who wore this shoe. My sister got the other one of the pair. I got one. But that is actually the size of a full-grown foot on a woman. And so you can imagine what a painful procedure that was. And all in the you know, guise of what made them valuable, what made them beautiful. Thankfully, that horrific process came to an end and was outlawed. And missionaries helped in going, when it became the law they could no longer bind feet. They went out into the villages to help unbind feet. and to stop the process. Now, if you haven't seen the movie Inn of Sixth Happiness, it might be something you should get from the library or rent. It's the story of a missionary lady named Gladys Aylward, who was used by the officials to go around to the villages and help unbind feet when it became outlawed. It's a very interesting story, and my mother knew her personally. In fact, she was in our home for a period of time. So, just if you haven't seen it, it's worthwhile to see it. Now, Mao Zedong, when he built up his forces, Chiang Kai-shek was the ruler, the premier of China. And he was very busy fighting the communists. He wanted to get rid of them. He was part of the nationalist government. A man by the name of Sun Yat-sen had made a republic out of China, and so emperors were no longer in power. And Chiang Kai-shek was part of the nationalist rule, and he wanted to get rid of the communists. Unfortunately, at that same time, the Japanese had started invading parts of Asia. They invaded Korea, Manchuria, and they were taking up the coastal areas of China. And you can see where Shanghai is, and of course that was on the coast of China. You can see Korea over there. Japan is just to the east of that. So they were crossing over and taking on territory. And Chiang Kai-shek was kidnapped by his own men, his own forces, who wanted him to stop fighting the communists, to join with the communists and Mao Zedong and fight off the Japanese who were invading the country. And when they kidnapped him, they took him up into a place in the hills to persuade him to do that, which worked. And the nationalist forces then joined forces with the communists to fight the Japanese. Well, when we were there in 1990 and we were there as tourists, they took us to the place where Chiang Kai-shek was kidnapped and kept by his own men until he agreed to this plan. And I said, I was here when that happened. I remember. And all these Chinese people standing around looking at this group of tourists that were there looked at me and they said, oh, you are very ancient. I was part of history as far as they were concerned. Well, I don't know what they think of me now. That was 21 years ago. I'm probably considered almost obsolete at this point in time. But the Japanese then were taking over the coastal areas of China. And that's when my parents and I was 6 years old at that time, had to flee from Xi'an, and we went to Shanghai, and it took us a month to travel from Xi'an to Shanghai because it was all kinds of rickety sort of buses that broke down and whatever conveyance you could find. It took a long time to travel that distance. And at one point, while we were fleeing, I was running around in the field. I was 6 years old, you know what the 6-year-olds do when they're bored. And a Chinese soldier grabbed a hold of me and said, don't run over there, it's filled with landmines. So a Chinese soldier rescued me when I was 6 years old, and it wasn't my time yet. So we got to Shanghai when I was 6, and it was there that arrangements were made for me to go to a British boarding school in a place called Chifu, which you see is kind of on the coast of China. It's now called Yantai. And Chifu is where a British missionary by the name of Hudson Taylor, who began the China Inland Mission, decided that missionaries needed a school for their children. The options for missionaries at that time, they had no homeschooling materials or things like that. There were no schools in that country. that could educate English-speaking children. He said, we need an English-speaking school. And so he founded this boarding school in Chifu. And this is where missionaries and business people would send their children for their education. The alternative to that was you sent your children back to their home country, and they either lived with relatives for their education or to a boarding school if there was one available. The Britishers usually sent their children to boarding schools in the UK, but this one then became the best English-speaking school east of the Suez. It had a very, very fine reputation. In fact, a very famous man was one of the students at Chifu. He was before my time. His name was Henry Luce, and he founded Time magazine. And so he came out of the Chifu schools at one point. I had to board a ship in Shanghai to go up to Chifu when I was entering boarding school. And one of the most significant early milestones of my life occurred in Shanghai the night before I got on board that ship to go to the boarding school. My parents were there as missionaries in China. They were there to preach the gospel. And incidentally, my mother used to gather crowds very easily because, as I said, she went there when the women were still having bound feet. And she had, number one, flaming red hair, and all the Chinese had dark hair, black hair, and she had size 10 shoes. So you can imagine she was a curiosity. She could gather the crowds without even trying. She'd just stand and they'd all come around looking at this strange white person with such huge feet. But they went there to help the Chinese come out of the darkness of idolatry. Idolatry was prevalent, and to teach them about the love of the Lord Jesus Christ. And in my father's zeal as a missionary, he did not neglect to evangelize his family. And I can remember as a little girl from the very beginning, my father used to tell me Bible stories, and he went through the entire Bible with me before I went away to school, telling me every story in the Bible, and he probably more than once. And it reminded me of a statement that the Apostle Paul made in writing to Timothy, a young man. And he said to Timothy when he wrote to him, you remember how from infancy you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. And my father began at infancy telling me Bible stories. And he instilled in me a great love of the Scriptures and a love of the Lord Jesus Christ. And the night before I got on that ship, at the age of 6, it dawned on me that I would not get to heaven on my parents' gold coattails. They were very good people. They were wonderful people. But I had to come to Jesus myself, and I knew I was a sinner. I lied, and I knew that I wasn't right with God. And I invited Jesus into my heart. And from that point on, I knew that the Lord Jesus Christ would be with me the rest of my life. Not only as my Savior, but as my friend, as my guide, as the one who promised never to leave me or forsake me. And so at the age of 6, I got on that ship, went to boarding school. I happened to have 2 older sisters already there who were 8 and 10 years older than I. My father was married in 1903 when he went to China, and his first wife passed away with congestive heart failure. And then he married another missionary lady who had 2 little girls, my 2 older sisters, and in delivering her 3rd child, She did not survive the delivery and the baby was never born. So he buried his second wife and an unborn child in China. My mother was his third wife, and I was the product of that third marriage. So I had these two older sisters and in the school. But even though they were there, leaving my parents at that early age was heartbreaking. It was very traumatic. And I can remember crying myself to sleep at night because I missed them so much. But between 6 and 9, we had a 1-year furlough, so I did see them, because you didn't go home on holidays, it took too long. And you couldn't get there and back during the holiday time, so we didn't see our parents years at a time. And I joined them for the furlough. My two older sisters came home on that furlough, and after 1 year, we returned to China, but my sister stayed in the United States to go on to school in the US. So, at the age of 9, then after a year's furlough in America, then we went back to China, and I went off to Chifu again. Now, during that time, from 1930, the end of 36, 37, the Japanese were occupying more and more territory, and Chifu was in Japanese-occupied territory. So, when I went back to school, we got used to seeing Japanese soldiers marching around. They'd go off in the hills in their lorries or trucks, and they'd fight the Chinese guerrillas up in the hills, and then they'd come back in their lorries, sometimes carrying the wounded, but we got used to them being in the area. We had a great big hockey field, and they had a great big British flag, the Union Jack, on the hockey field, so that bombers going overhead would know this piece of territory is British, so don't bomb it. And because we weren't in the war yet, we were still neutral. And I discovered that school was, being in a British boarding school, you learn that school is very important. And the British have a great attitude about life, and that is, have a stiff upper lip. You know, you just took things as they were, and boy, you were gonna learn your lessons no matter what. They were gonna pound education into these kids no matter what. So, the rules of the school sometimes got me in trouble because we weren't allowed to talk at meal times, we weren't allowed to talk in our dormitories getting ready for bed, and of course we weren't allowed to talk in classes or church. You know, we weren't allowed to talk. And so I would get into trouble for talking when I wasn't supposed to. The minute I got out of boarding school a few years later, I was talking. And they haven't been able to shut me up since. In fact, I was talking to somebody the other day, and a woman came to me later and she said, well, I was going to stop and talk to you, but you were already talking to somebody. And I said, if I stop talking, I'm dead. So anyway, this was one of the many rules, but they were these were missionary people who gave themselves to teaching missionary children. So what we were going through as children, they were too. And then one day, and today, it's an anniversary day for you, for me, December 7th, it's Pearl Harbor Day. 70 years ago today, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. But for me, it was December 8th. And to this day, Pearl Harbor Day is December 8th because we were on the other side of the international date line. And the soldiers who had always stayed outside of our premises then came in with their guns and their bayonets. And they marched in and said, war has been declared, you are now our prisoners. And from that point on, we were interned. Now, on the pictures ahead in front of you, you see my first home in Xi'an, where I was born, and I'm the little girl in front. You can take a closer look at these. In the second picture, you'll see that when I went to school in Shifu at the age of 6, that was my first girlfriend in school, and her name is Beryl. And for 75 years to this day, we are best friends. We still keep in touch, although she lives in England. The third picture is of the school buildings, and the Japanese marched in. One was for the girls' school, one building was for the boys' school. There were over 200 children that were primarily missionary kids in these buildings. And so this is the premises that we were on. And the Japanese decided they liked our buildings, and they were going to take them over one by one for their own soldiers. But during that time period, when we were their prisoners, we had to wear armbands with our nationality on them. I had an A on mine as an American, the British had a B, and the Norwegians had an N, because the Norwegians were part of the Allies. The Swedes didn't have to wear anything because they were still neutral. And actually, there were very few Swedish Scandinavians in that area. But from that point, when they took over us as their prisoners, they would march through the grounds, they would make sure that we knew that they were in charge and that we had very little contact with the outside world. They took all the radios out, and it was life changed dramatically. And the thing was that they didn't provide food for us, which was under the Geneva Convention, but they didn't give food for us. And so the staff people combined their resources as much as they could, and they would buy from vendors over the wall until money ran out. And this is sometimes when classes would stop and we would spend time praying that God would supply our needs. And in one way or another, money came in or food came over the wall to feed these children and their staff. And it was amazing how miraculously the Lord kept providing for us. 12 years later, I was married and living in Chicago, and a Chinese gentleman came to our church to visit, and we invited him to our home, to our apartment, for dinner after church. And as we sat at the table, I asked him where he came from, and he said, "I grew up in Shifu." I thought, oh, I went to school in Shifu. Here he was in Chicago 12 years later. And we found out that he was a traveling evangelist in China. That was his business. And he said he would come home periodically to visit his family, his parents in Shifu. And he said he discovered one day when he was visiting that the Japanese had taken over the school, and he said, "We heard that they were starving the children." So he went back to the area where he was doing his evangelistic work, and he started contacting Christians out there. And he said, "You know, these children need to be fed. We need to take up an offering for them." And he gathered up money and contributions from people in other parts. And there was even a German couple who were not interned because they were part of the Axis people who were passing food over the wall to us. But Charles Lee was the Chinese evangelist who had done this. And he said, "I came back to Shifu with that gathered money." And he said, "I got it over the wall." He knew people, that's where he had grown up. And he was able to make contact secretly, and he got that money over the wall, and it was one of the miracles that God did in keeping us alive. Well, then one day the Japanese said, "That's it, we want all your buildings, we want you out of here." Well, there was no place in the city that could hold all of us. So they decided to divide us up into 3 different groups. They took the boys' school one way and the girls' school to another place. And that 4th picture there is Temple Hill, where the girls' school was. And part of the tourist party that went in 1990 was my friend Beryl and her brother. All 3 of us had been born in China, grew up there, and her 3 daughters and one of our sons were a group of 8 that went on this trip. And that was, you can see that their gates there, was a gateway there, and we couldn't go in there because it was still a military installation, but that was a single family home. It was a large home, but they ended up putting 99 of us in that building. 36 of us slept on the attic floor. Some slept on an enclosed porch. We were jammed in. But one of the things we had done when we marched across town carrying our little bundles and all the things that we could take with us was some were assigned to carry chamber pots. You know what those are? Yes, of course you do. And not all of us grew up with indoor plumbing, and there wasn't any indoor plumbing. And again, in 1990 when we were there was a Chinese vendor on the street, and we asked him if he remembered the school. He said, oh yes, I remember the line of children marching across here with their bundles across the city. He didn't say anything about the chamber pots, but we remembered that was part of the equipment we took with us. But we ended up in this very crowded home in Temple Hill. School went on. You have to understand that the British believe in education, and they were determined they were going to teach us, even though they didn't have all the materials that you might want. The Japanese came in. Now they were providing food for us. And they would make us line up every day, and we had to count off. And then one day they said, now you've got to learn to count in Japanese. So we did. Ichi ni san shi go raku sechi hachi ku chu. So we would count off, that's 1 to 10 in Japanese. And we learned to count off in Japanese, and they would come and make sure that nobody had tried to get over the wall. And this was a time when we were really cut off from the outside world. We're coming up to our Christmas time. And before we got to Temple Hill, one of the Christmases when we were interned by the Japanese still in our school grounds, there was no mail coming back and forth, or very little. And the teachers realized that the children weren't going to get gifts from their parents. We were, most of us, separated from our parents. And so they decided for the girls, they were going to knit little knitted hats. And they got all the yarn they could. They even unraveled sweaters to get yarn. And on Christmas morning, Father Christmas, not Santa Claus, Father Christmas came with his sack of gifts, and every little girl got a handmade knitted hat for Christmas. It was a memorable Christmas. But in the very crowded situation where we didn't have communication with the outside world. And that probably was the loneliest time of my school years. We were interned. We didn't know what was going on. I didn't know if my parents were alive. I didn't know what was happening to them. They didn't know what was happening to me. And I was 11, 12, and 13, being a prisoner of war, separated from my family. Put yourself in my mother's place. She would wake up at night and I wonder how my little girl's doing. But as I said, these were people who believed in the Lord and in His Word. And the verse that the Lord gave to my mother was, I know whom I have believed, and I'm persuaded that He's able to keep what I've committed to Him against that day. And she said, I would say that verse and say, okay, Lord, I've committed my daughter to you. I can trust you for her care. And she could go back to sleep. For me, I remember sitting against the wall, and the wall was topped with cement, and it had glass chips on it, so nobody would try to escape. And I would sit against the wall and be reading my Bible. And the Lord would comfort me with words like, don't be afraid or discouraged. I will never leave you nor forsake you. And it brought peace to my heart. Milestones in my life where I knew God was still watching out for me. But then after a period of time, a Japanese doctor came in with people with him, and he had needles and syringes in his pocket and his bag, and he started injecting all the American children. He made all the Americans come forward and lined up, and it was a hot August afternoon, and he started giving us injections, and he lined us up, gave us an injection in one arm, and then he gave us an injection in the other arm, and then he came back and gave us a third injection. Then we found out that it was in preparation for the Americans who were going to be repatriated. We were going to be exchanged for Japanese prisoners of war in this country that we had known nothing about. But we were going to be repatriated one-on-one. And so this was starting then our repatriation process. Well, we had had a 3-month epidemic of mumps in our camp, and I had not gotten the mumps until the day before we were supposed to leave. And all of a sudden I broke out like a chipmunk with my swollen face and temperature, and I was sicker than a dog. And concentration camp. This one had about 2,000 people. And we went from Chifu by ship down to the coast just below Chifu here, where it's marked, and Wei Shen was the name of the camp. It's now Wei Feng. But they had about 2,000 prisoners there who were a whole mixture of business people, missionaries, doctors, all kinds of people. And probably the most famous person in that camp was Eric Liddell of Chariots of Fire. Another film, if you haven't seen or haven't seen it for a while, you should be sure to get, because he was an Olympic runner and won the Olympic gold medal in 1924 and ended up in China as a missionary and was interned by the Japanese. And I happened to end up in that same camp with him. Now this was a very crowded camp. The food wasn't that great. They didn't have dishes. My dish was a little empty sardine tin. That was my plate. And so whatever you could get into that little sardine tin was what we ate. And it was very difficult. But 3 weeks later, the rest of the school was brought down. So my friend Beryl, who was British, was with that group of the rest of the children who were then transferred to Wei Shen, where they stayed for the duration. I was there just for a few weeks. And then they made a list of Americans out of this much larger concentration camp that were going to be on that repatriation list. Not every American was on the list. In our school, there were so few Americans, they took all of us. And we had one teacher that was American who went with us. But from Wei Shen, they had to go on a list. And there were 390 of us after they got that list completed. And my friend Beryl and I spent as much time as we could together before we were put on a train to leave Wei Shen. And one of the things we did was one night we went out and looked at the stars. We could see the stars there. The sky was clear. You didn't have light pollution and other polluting things. And there's a great big W in the sky, which is the constellation Cassiopeia. Her maiden name was Welsh, Beryl Welsh. And I, being Winnie, we decided that every time we saw the W in the sky, we would think of each other. I haven't been able to see a W in Schaumburg. There is just too much pollution and light, but I think about her a lot, and we've done it until this day. But we made a pact that we would always keep in touch with each other, and we have, when she was finally released at the end of the war. But we started out by train then from Weishan to go to Shanghai, where we were to get on board a ship. And the Weishan camp, incidentally, is the gate to the Weishan camp is this picture, and my friend Beryl and I, that's one of the barracks where they kept prisoners in Weishan, the 2,000 that were there. And that's when we were there in 1990 as visitors, as tourists. So anyway, we got on board the train, and it was supposed to take a day and a night to get to Shanghai. 390 of us, they gave us one little sack of lunch to take. We hadn't been on the road very long before the train was stopped and put on a sidetrack. And the officers in charge said, "Guerrilla fighters have come out of the hills and sabotaged the tracks, and the train immediately preceding ours has been wrecked. In fact, in one situation, it was blown up. And they did this sabotage all the time because they didn't want the Japanese troops moving on those tracks. They didn't want armaments moving on those tracks. They did everything they could to hinder the war effort by the Japanese. 4 times on that short trip, the train immediately preceding ours was wrecked. And we had to wait for them to fix the tracks so we could proceed. As I said, our lunch was long gone. We finally pulled into Nanking, and where we were to change trains. And Nanking isn't marked, but it's before you get to Shanghai, and north of Shanghai. And we had to wait in the station for another train to come. And then the officer came out real quickly and said, if you hurry up, they've attached 3 cars on the back of a train with pigs. It was a livestock or whatever, pigs. Anyway, they were transporting. And they attached 3 cars, 390 people and their luggage, got on, crammed into those 3 cars, and pulled out of there in 7 minutes. The Japanese officer said later he had never seen people move that quickly. But as soon as we were out of Nanking, Nanking was bombed. We pulled out of Nanking after 3 days and 3 nights. I think it was almost 4 days, really, by the time we got to Shanghai. We finally pulled into Shanghai. Tired, hot, hungry, bedraggled. And we stood in line to be counted again. By this time, they'd added some other prisoners from other camps that had been picked up, and they had to be sure. And I thought, why would they count us? We've been told we're going to America. Why would we go now? We're going back home to our country. But the thing was, there was a treaty that had been made between the Japanese government and the US that 1,500 internees, Japanese internees in the United States, would be exchanged for 1,500 American prisoners of war from various camps. We finally picked up people on the ship in the Philippines and in Hong Kong and even in Saigon until we matched 1,500. But the thing was, they couldn't lose one person or the treaty would fall through, and we would all be returned to our concentration camps. So it was very important that they made sure every one of us was accounted for. That's why they kept counting us. Well, the next morning, we got on board a ship called the Teamaru. This was the Japanese ship. In peacetime, it held 600 people. And By the time they got all the prisoners on board, there were 1,500 of us. 240 women and girls were in a stateroom. They built 2 tiers of shelves and put little mats right next to each other. We were just jammed in like sardines. The men and boys were put in the hold. And so 1,500 of us were on that ship. And they had great big white crosses painted on it. At night, there was a lighted white cross to show that it was a refugee ship. So hopefully, we would see periscopes. You know, we didn't know submarines if they were friend or foe. And it was supposed to keep us from being torpedoed by anybody out in the seas. And it obviously worked because we weren't torpedoed. But on that ship, we were on there for 5 weeks, going from around Shanghai, by way of the Philippines and Hong Kong. We went through the Straits of Java and Sumatra, which you can't see here, but you can see it later on this map, which were supposedly the most heavily mined waters of the Pacific during World War II. And we had a little pilot ship that led us through those heavily mined waters. And I tell you, nobody slept that night. We were watching that little pilot ship taking us through, hoping that he remembered where the mines were. And we obviously got through. And for 5 weeks, we had 3 meals a day on the Japanese ship. But for any of you who happen to have a Lutheran heritage, forgive me, but our meals, our diet was called the Lutheran diet. And the reason was, and you have to know your Lutheran history to appreciate this, we got little bowls of rice that was dirty and filled with worms. And so it was the diet of worms. Now, anybody who knows anything about Martin Luther knows that he met the council in the city of Worms in Japan, and the council was called the Diet. So that's why it got dubbed the Lutheran Diet, that we had for 5 weeks. We had dirty rice with worms. And I remember we were good missionary kids. We'd come, we'd sit down, we'd thank the Lord. We did. And then we'd pick out the worms and line the plate. Now, some people were brave people. They decided they were going to get their protein no matter what. I couldn't stomach it. So I would try and eat what was left behind. But that's all we had for 5 weeks while we were on that ship. On our way to, now it doesn't show here, but on this map, Goa, India. Now Goa was Portuguese, which was neutral during World War II, so that's where the exchange was going to take place. The Te Amaro pulled into Goa, and the Swedish Gripsholm had been commandeered. It was a neutral ship to bring the Japanese internees from the United States to meet with us in Goa, where the exchange was going to take place. And there were 1,500 of them, of Japanese people that were interned here. And we understood that some of them volunteered, and some of them were Christians who said they wanted to go back to the land of their origin to tell their people about Jesus, and they volunteered to be exchanged for these Americans that were being brought from various camps in Asia. And so we were exchanged body for body. Another tremendous milestone in my life is that the 2 lines crossed each other. We weren't right next to each other, but close enough that we could see one another. And someone in one of those lines began to sing a hymn. And so the Christians in the other line joined them. The Japanese internees, the American internees. Our governments were at war. But we were believers in Jesus Christ, and we weren't at war with one another. We were one. We were one because we were believers in Him. That made such a mark on my life of how God transcends the worst things that man can do. But He can't triumph over your soul and your spirit if you trust in Him. Jesus is the King of Kings. He's the Lord of Lords. We're recognizing His birth. And only He can bring together people who their governments may say are our enemies and bring them together as one with one another. And we were one. They got on the Japanese ship, and we felt very sorry for them. We hoped that they would get better food than we did. We got on the Gripsholm, and being a Swedish ship, they met us with a smorgasbord. And the yay for the Swedes, they know how to cook. And the ship's doctor had to come and say on the PA system, don't overdo it, because the infirmary isn't that big on the Swedish Gripsholm. But it felt like we were going to heaven, I tell you. When we got on that ship and saw all the food in its abundance, the captain of the ship said he had never seen such an emaciated group of people as the 1,500 that got on. But we didn't stay emaciated. We had 5 weeks on the Swedish Gripsholm, and we got fed well, and I think we got fattened up a bit before we got home, because I can remember my aunt thinking, well, you don't look like you've been in prison, you know. Well, it was because we'd been fed well for 5 weeks and made up for lost time. But after we stopped in South America, South Africa first, and then we stopped in Rio de Janeiro, where we were able to get off the ship, and then we finally ended up in New York. And it was December. We'd been on the ocean for 10 weeks. And it had been a trip of a lifetime. Red Cross came on board and had some clothing because our clothes were rags. And so we had some clothing. And we had some help on the way. So we weren't too bad off when we landed in New York. But it was a gray, wet December morning, in the middle of December, when we pulled up the Hudson River, and there were 1,500 people leaning over the railing of that ship on one side. And what do you think we were looking for? The Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty. We were free. We were free. And I can't begin to tell you what it felt like to know that I was home. To know that we were free. That we weren't going to be counted every few hours, that we weren't going to be under guard all the time. My parents were still in China. They were in a part of China that had not been occupied by the Japanese. They were in the interior. They were under bombing. I didn't see them for 5 years, from the time I was 9 until I was 14. I was met when I got off the Swedish Gripsholm by a Red Cross lady. And I had been turned over to the guardianship of an aunt and uncle through the mails, my parents had arranged it, and the Red Cross, and my aunt and uncle were in New Jersey. And so that Red Cross lady took me through customs and took me to my aunt and uncle's house in East Orange, New Jersey. A few days later, I came down with pneumonia and had to be hospitalized. And one of the funny things that happened was that in the hospital, they give you healthy food. And so chicken soup is supposed to be good. The only problem was that the chicken soup they gave me was rice. I could not stand the sight of rice. I just expected a worm to crawl out of it. It took me a long time before I could get used to rice. So my dear uncle had to tell the authorities, look, please don't give this girl any rice. Give her something else. Noodles, maybe, the Chinese eat noodles, man. But anyway, it was one of those kind of comical things. My aunt took my messy little kind of straw woven case that had the poor clothing that I had in it, and she put it in the bathtub. And as soon as she saw a cockroach crawling out of it, she took the whole thing, took it downstairs and put it in the furnace. Everything was burned up the next day. And we had to borrow clothing from a neighbor. And then we went shopping. Now that's before I got pneumonia. I got totally outfitted before I was hospitalized. And anything that could possibly have carried an insect was gotten rid of very quickly with my aunt. My parents came home a year later. They had to fly over the hump of Burma. And it was very dangerous traveling for them, but they made it. I had not seen them. I was now 14. I had not seen them since I was 9. I couldn't remember what they looked like. I didn't have a picture. And I said to my uncle, please point them out to me. I don't want to be embarrassed. But I knew them when they arrived. And it was tremendous to have their reunion with my parents that I hadn't seen for so long. The thing that I take away from that segment of my life is that God is faithful to what he promises. He's faithful to his word. He is faithful in his love and commitment to us. And anyone who trusts in him can have the confidence they're not alone and never will be, because he's committed to us if we believe in him. To this day, I'm 81. I have yet to see the Lord fail in anything he has promised to do. Oh, it doesn't mean you live a a free life. We don't. We have all the aches and pains that goes along with the territory. You know, the cataract surgeries, the breaks. I've had 14 fractures. I've had just about every, we talk about sitting at dinner sometimes and have organ recitals. Now that means organs in you. What's going wrong with that particular organ. I've had a lot of organs removed. But when Jesus Christ came into my life at the age of 6, it was a decision that I made and that he made to me to be my Lord and my Savior. And he says, we're going to walk to another home. I'm aiming for another home. Someday, to be with him in heaven. And we're going to do it together. Trust him. believe in him. We're all on a journey. And it doesn't matter what stage of that journey you're on. You can have a relationship with the living Lord who will never leave you nor forsake you. So, that's my journey so far. And I love this verse in the prophet Isaiah. The Lord will be the sure foundation for your times, a rich store of salvation and wisdom and knowledge. The fear of the Lord is the key to this treasure. God bless you.
She performed for us today, and I want everybody to feel free to come up here and
take a
look at
look.
pictures.
And you can get a closer look. I'll put these on the table. Oh, I forgot to tell you, this is an abacus. My husband kept the mission treasury accounts on this abacus. He didn't have a computer so he kept the treasury on this abacus. Here's the little shoe. Come up and take a good close look at it. And imagine a real woman living there. And then remember, this is a figure, but the figures were life-size that were made.
Amazing. Just amazing. Well, I was very impressed. What a wonderful speaker.
Yes, really was. What was the movie?
What was that?
The movie that you mentioned at the beginning?
At the beginning, The Inn of Sixth Happiness. It stars Ingrid Bergman.
The what?
The Inn
I-N-N.
of Sixth Happiness. And it was about a missionary who went to China and helped with the unraveling of bound feet. And the other one was, Chariots of Fire. If you haven't seen that, you may have seen that. Yeah.
Thank you.
No.